happened before. And you also don't want to forget that you're using them and throw without a bat, because at this point, if that's sticking up and you're throwing and it jams into the side of your hand, you can imagine that it would hurt quite a bit. Now I've left my wheel kind of messy, and that mess will help keep my bat stuck down to the wheel head real well. I'm going to center my clay just like I normally would, but I might not get it quite as high, particularly if it's in good shape, if it's pretty well wedged. For centering a plate, you need to get the clay centered, obviously. For throwing a plate, you want to have the clay real low when you start, but that doesn't mean you don't want to get it centered, because the issues of being off center and things like that are going to be just as bad when you're working with a plate as they would be if you're working with a bowl or cylinder. So as I compress this down, now that it's centered, as I bring it down, my left hand is going to be pushing the clay down. My right hand is going to be pushing into the clay to make sure that it doesn't mushroom, it doesn't come around and curve and leave an indent underneath. I want it to fill in that space nice and evenly. So throwing a plate isn't so much hard as if it's sort of a finesse thing. So a lot of people really have trouble with a plate, particularly moving from a basic flat clay shape to a clearly intentional kind of plate shape. So as I've been talking, I've been compressing this clay and trying to keep it nice and even. Now I have relatively small hands, and so I find that I have to kind of move my hands around on the clay. Some people with bigger hands feel like they can get it flattened just basically pushing down on it. Whatever works for you, as long as it stays very even, very flat, very compressed. So I've got my clay flattened down, centered and flattened out. Now I'm going to drill my hole. Now the steps are just like they would be in making a bowl, except to drill my hole, it's about as far as I'm going to go. And now I'm going to spend a lot more time opening out the wall. Now I'll slow down a little bit. You always go faster when you're centering than you do on all the rest of the steps. Now you notice as I'm pulling out my wall, I'm really combining the steps of compressing my rim with pulling out my wall. Because as I come out, the clay wants to come up. That's the path of least resistance. I'm dragging the back of my hands down onto this section of the clay so that it compresses and fills in. And you also notice I keep going back to the center. Even though I drilled my hole, I'm trying to get this to pull out very evenly to keep my floor real flat. I'm keeping it as flat as I can, and then of course I'll spend some time flattening it out with a rib later. One thing that people tend to do when they're pulling, and you can see it happening a little bit with me, is that when they pull out the wall they use more pressure here than they did in here. It's easier, you're closer to it, and so you can use your body weight a little bit more, but you want to be careful you don't do that too much, or you're going to end up with a plate that bows in the middle. So I'm going to use a sponge to compress my rim. Got some just slip that's coming off the surface of the clay. The clay's pretty soft, and I recommend boxed clay for when you are throwing a plate, or make sure it's wedged real well. Clay that has some unevenness and dryness, or air pockets, air bubbles, those things are going to make throwing a plate harder because they're going to show up a little bit more and it's harder to get rid of them. So I've been pulling my wall out this whole time, or pulling my floor out. Now is the first time that I've really gotten into the wall. But before I mess with the wall, I want to get back in here and worry about the floor of the plate, because the plate is mostly just a big flat space with a frame around it. And that flat space is going to be where the viewer, the user of the plate, is spending their time looking. And so it's got to be the place where you as the maker spend the most time making it nice. So I'm using the wooden rib to compress this floor. Nice thing about the wooden rib is I've got this flat section, although you noticed I started using the rounded section as well. You can use any sort of rib. Some people even like to use an old credit card. It's a little bit softer, has rounded edges. I'll sometimes use my metal rib if I can find it. And the metal rib, just like with the wooden rib, you've got the flat section. Notice how I'm letting the rib kind of bend so that the clay is coming into the rib rather than cutting in with the rib or having it bounce. Oops. I can also use the flat edge of this rib if I prefer. So now what I've done is I've compressed my floor and I've flattened it. So it looks nicer, but it's also a lot stronger because I've kept compressing it. Now I'm going to use my damp sponge to work on my rim, and I'm going to start to pull out the wall, because this here really is the wall. Now there's a lot of different plate shapes you can do. You can have this be a curved kind of shape like I'm starting to make right now, or you can make a little bit more distinction in your rim and kind of bend this rim back. Even though I got some chunks there, you see how this is a nice curved shape. This would be a shape sauces and things wouldn't spill out of. A little bit more formal kind of plate might be one where it comes up at an angle and then this edge bends down, and you see how I've bent that down by pushing my middle finger, my underneath finger is pushing up and my top finger is pushing down. I'm dragging the sponge along as an extra way to compress. Now hopefully I've gotten most of the gloopy stuff off of here so that it's not getting in my way. I've been throwing for quite a while, so I'm getting extra gloopy everywhere. But the other thing I can do with the rib, whether it be this rib or another rib, is I can get in here and I can do some adjustment, some cleaning up of this edge. And so I can use a flat edge of a rib, a corner, to create a flat edge on my foot. You see this one's kicked up a little bit of clay, and I can go back in there with that one. I can also, if you saw me working with this rib has this straight edge and then this curve, and if I let that guide my shape, then that edge there on this out here goes from a flat floor to a curve, and I can control that more and less. It's really important as well, your plates can either be trimmed or not. This one has a thick enough floor that it's going to be trimmed later on. I've thrown it on the bat, and just like with a bowl, we sometimes tend to look at it from the top. Okay, top looks good, great. Get your eyes down here, because one of the things I tend to see on beginning plates, besides rims that didn't get compressed like I'm doing now, is that the top looks fine and the bottom's super thick. Now some of that you can fix when you're trimming, but not all of it. Alright, don't do that. And obviously if something like that happens, I could leave it on there as a decoration, but it really was an accident. So I'm going to go ahead and clean that up. Remember, cleaning up with a rib, cleaning up with a chamois gives a different look than cleaning up with a sponge or cleaning up with your fingers, whether it's on the wheel or not. And so I recommend that you really be intentional and conscious about how you do cleanup and things like that. Accidents happen, but there is a different look when you've got a lot of sloppy stuff on it than when you don't. Now you can also undercut the edge here a little bit. I can't get a ton of undercut in this because of the angle of the rim and the angle of my splash pan on my wheel, but I can get some. All of that's not going to be something I have to trim. And I also say that you need to cut through your floor. Now we're leaving it on the bat so that we don't have to warp it when we take it off, because you've got all this flat area that if you tried to pick it up it would want to sink and fall. But it is still important for you to undercut it so that it'll come off. As it dries, the clay is going to shrink, and you don't want the clay to shrink. You don't want the clay to shrink and then cause some sort of cracking through the middle because it shrunk over the top and couldn't move. That cut under there, even though it may not come off without another cut, will prevent that from happening. Now, of course, the nice thing about the bat is I've just taken my piece off the bat, and now if I've